Good afternoon. Welcome all. Thank you for joining us for this in the latest series of, well, what we were calling TTF fireside chats, but it's getting a bit warm now to have the fire on. So this is kind of a fireside chat without the fire on. So we've got a great couple of presentations for you this afternoon. In a while, I'll be talking about the traffic signal funding program that we're running now and giving you a quick walk through the assessment process that's currently underway for local authorities. So I'm hoping you all stay around for that. But before that, we have a really interesting presentation on the local authority data guidance workshop. And I'd like to pass over to Graham to briefly introduce that. Graham.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Darren. For those of you who don't know me, I am Graham Hansen. I'm the SRO, I believe, for the Transport Technology Forum, and I lead the Smarter Traffic Management team at the Department of Transport. I think most of you will know, but most of my team's work does focus on data, whether that's connected vehicle data, operational data, data that local authorities depend on to deliver better traffic management. And I guess I don't believe transport data really had a higher profile. I think we all watched the number 10 daily conferences highlighting the transport impacts of COVID. And we all expect that advances in data will improve the way that the future transport services are devised, planned, delivered. And for my point, my real interest is the role of local authority transport data in this. I believe that's pivotal. And I'm sure that most of you or some of you will remember the user research that the Department commissioned consultant North Highlands to undertake several years ago now. The research focus was very much a user research focus on the availability and openness of local authority data. The findings of the report were quite stark in some ways. It did find that there were pockets of excellence, but actually most local authorities, it found, didn't open and share data currently. It also found that there was no real cacheable value in local authority transport data, but there was real social value in providing data, potentially for providing social impacts, but particularly for operational and for local authority better traffic management delivery. We have undertaken a significant amount of work in the last couple of years to deliver many of the recommendations from North Highlands, and I guess many of you will have been involved in our work, including the development of a data model to enable us to digitise traffic regulation orders, building a national access point to provide a national catalogue of roads-based data catalogue, and piloting the national parking platform, to mention a few of the major projects we've been involved in. But one thing North Highland were very clear about was that if we want to improve local authority data maturity, then the department has to take a proactive role in that development. And we have done so in many ways. We provided £1 million for 11 authorities to open their data and share that through the TTF process. But one of the outstanding recommendations for us was to develop and provide national guidance for local authorities to open and share their transport data in a consistent format. So we've recently commissioned Atkins to undertake this work. I think it's the last major recommendation from the North Highland work, and we've been very keen that the work is focused on providing an end-to-end process for enabling local authorities to open the data, but with a real development of user need behind that. What is it that local authorities need to understand to help them share and open their data? Very importantly, what is the value for local authorities? Why would a local authority want to open its data? What are the benefits that it can provide? But also to focus on three key pillars, I suppose we call them, for transport: the future of transport agenda, delivering the new mobility. How will better transport data help local authorities to help deliver future transport? Active travel, we're all very engaged in promoting walking and cycling. What data needs do local authorities need to provide, and how can sharing that data improve that process? And traffic management. We come from, our division is traffic management. We're really focused on improving the services that local authorities need to provide. So with that, I'll hand you over to Jill from Atkins, who will just introduce herself. Atkins have now been operating the contract for several months. Jill, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everyone. So yeah, I'm a technical director at Atkins, and I guess leading this work from an Atkins point of view, and I will just share my slides. Hopefully this has progressed along to the second slide, and so Graham has sort of talked us through this already. So the project is going to produce guidance for English local authorities to open up, share and exploit their data, and the fact that it needs to be truly user-centred. So we have Claire Williams, who is a human factors expert on the team, leading that, and we'll be talking about that quite a lot in the remainder of this presentation. Again, the context, Graham mentioned the local transport data discovery, which was really key, and some policies that directly rely on open data. In particular, future of transport is really not possible without open data. And then there's some open data policies and activities that DFT have been progressing in the last few years, which I won't read the list out, but you can see on the screen. So then the project scope, there's several work packages. The first couple we have basically completed. So the first one, which we'll be talking about a bit today, Stephen's going to talk about, is an evidence review of the current data landscape. So some of you will have responded to our questionnaire, and we'll be presenting the results of that shortly. We have lots of discussions with subnational transport bodies, future transport zones, third-party suppliers, a wide range of people. And that has given us a huge amount of information about the current status of data and how it's moved on from North Highland, the local transport data discovery. And then the second thing we've done and recently finished basically is to do detailed interviews and workshops with local authorities to understand their user needs for the guidance and pain points, basically challenges, reasons why they're not currently opening their data. And then we've also been interviewing the end users of the data, because although the guidance has to focus on local authorities' needs, given that the data is going to be eventually shared with other people, we do need to consider the needs of the end users of the data as well. And then the third thing that is going to feed into the guidance is a review of the operational benefits of and new business models for local transport data. And this is really, really key, and Graham mentioned it, the fact what is the value to local authorities of opening and sharing their data? If somebody in an authority is thinking, why do I need to share my data? We need to be able to provide exemplars and case studies and really good evidence of why it is useful to share your data, basically. And then the final work package that we're just starting on now is actually getting down and developing the guidance, and we'll be using the user needs specification to do that. So I will now hand over to Stephen Nand-Lal, who is going to talk us through the results from the questionnaire that we asked local authorities to respond to.
Yeah, hi everyone. So Stephen here. So I'm working on the technical delivery of this project. So just to go over the questionnaire responses. So we distributed the questionnaire through a number of channels, including TTF, and we received 61 responses spanning 49 local authorities, STBs, combined authorities, and the like. So the respondents were split between people who are responsible for doing data and data sharing as part of their job, and also those that are accountable, being a 42-62 split as indicated. And then we also asked respondents about the data capability of their local authority. And as we can see here, the majority of kind of respondents said their local authorities had individual teams who were responsible for doing their own data and analytics. And then a smaller proportion, however, still a significant, almost a quarter, said they have a dedicated data and analytics team within the local authority. So this is important for shaping our guidance and in terms of understanding who we're writing our guidance for. So moving on to the next slide. So the next few questions started to look at the types of data that local authorities had. And so we split this into 3 categories. So initially we're looking at traffic and parking data. And so presented here is the extent to which the respondents, local authorities, share the data. So red means that the local authority do not generate or own. The orange means that it's closed, so the local authority have it and aren't currently sharing it. Grey indicates unsure, and then green indicates varying levels of shared, whether it's group-based access, where there are usage limitations, or the darkest green, where it's open and public access. So in terms of the data that is shared the most, we can see that roadworks data is most often shared due to mandatory reporting, and this is closely followed by EV charging locations and geographical data. And then network performance and flows then follows. So moving on to the next slide, we're looking at active travel data. And in terms of active travel data, I suppose somewhat unsurprisingly, a lot of local authorities do not generate or own any of this data. However, where it exists and where it's captured by local authorities, it's more likely to be shared to some extent. So as this is a new form of data for local authorities to be gathering, this is perhaps unsurprising. So then on to the next slide, we've also just looked at a slightly wider type of data. So we can see from this slide that emissions and environmental data is the most likely to be shared. However, we can also see that freight, licensing and sentiment analysis are the least likely to be owned or generated. So if we move on to the next slide, we now look at traffic data that local authorities are receiving externally from third parties, and we can see there's high levels and high numbers of local authorities that bring in data from Highways England in floating vehicle data, roadworks data and other. So in terms of understanding the data that local authorities have access to, this was a really helpful insight. So moving on to the next question, we look at how local authorities themselves are storing their data. See that the vast majority of respondents indicated their local authorities using their own data store, and then there are some, or a high percentage, that are using cloud-based systems or supplier-provided systems. So moving on to the next slide, we started to look at the data standards that local authorities used. We can see that the most common and the most frequently used are UTMC, ANPR, and NAPTAN. So these are the most common data standards, and then some of the others have very few users. I can just see in the comment, one of them says, difficult to see in depth on screen. Yeah, hopefully that will be okay for most people to be able to see. So moving on to the next slide. So we looked at local authorities currently sharing data with other parties, and we can see that there's high percentages of local authorities, somewhere in the region of 70 to 80% sharing with other public sector entities, for example, other local authorities or governmental bodies or the DFT. And then there's a smaller percentage that are sharing with emergency services, local entities and public transport operators, and then a smaller percentage again sharing with service providers or public sector. So moving on to the next slide, we started to look at how data was shared by local authorities. And the most frequent and the most common ways are the more traditional manners. So for example, spreadsheets, emails, and then there's also a high percentage that share them via a website, file transfer services, or even their own data platform. So if we move on to the next slide, we're looking at the file formats in which local authorities are sharing the data. And again, we've got a similar pattern where there's lots of the more traditional file formats for people to share in. So for example, static CSV or PDF files. Then there's also increasing numbers of, for example, sharing via XML or shapefiles where it's the possibility to have real-time data. So on to the final slide now, and we were looking at the pain points that local authorities have really faced in terms of sharing data and setting up an open data platform. So some of the more classical responses, for example, lack of resources or IT issues, are up there in terms of the most frequently mentioned by a local authority. We've also got data storage and maintenance by third parties being a common issue there that people have faced. So there's a real range of issues here, and we've kind of, to gather this, we've used responses from the North Highland report, the previous report that Graham mentioned. We've also combined that with discussions we've had with local authorities, really to get to grips and to understand what their issues are and what they've been facing. So that's it for the questionnaire summary. So I'll just hand back to Jill now, who will talk through the findings from this section.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. So, just to summarise, as Stephen says, the key findings. So, data sharing has increased in the last few years. So, even since the local transport data discovery in 2017. We can see that there are more people sharing their data, but I guess the surprising, or maybe not surprising thing, but the thing that North Highland found that there were pockets of excellence. I guess that's kind of it's still the case that a lot of people are sharing their data, but they're sending someone a spreadsheet or a PDF, so it's not sharing real-time data. Which, if you have a real-time feed on a website, it's not taking you any time to share your data, and that's where maybe some of the real big operational benefits could come. So it's interesting that a lot of the data sharing is still done through quite a manual process. And then, as Stephen said, the pain points that we'd identified from various sources is still a lot of agreement with what we've been what we assumed the pain points would be, and these come from places like the DFT data strategy, the local transport data discovery. Even we did the connected vehicle data strategy research last summer, and we identified very similar pain points. So at least we know that when we come to write the guidance, we are properly understanding what people's challenges are. There are some great examples of local authorities sharing data, and it's really interesting that the subnational transport bodies, obviously, they rely on understanding the data from across their regions. So it's really important for local authorities to be sharing data with their STBs, and we're seeing some really positive results there, so that's good. And the other thing is that we've seen, as Graham said, that when there was a real requirement to share data with COVID-19, it really showed what could be done, and that we can build on that and learn lessons from the success of that. I guess the last key message that has come out is the future transport agenda relies on data sharing. The future transport zones are all very seriously considering how they're going to do their data sharing. Some of the best examples we saw of data sharing were from some of the e-scooter and bike share schemes, that sort of thing. So there are some positives, as well as, still a lot more can be done, and a lot of progress hopefully will be made by us producing this guidance. So just move on to the investigation we've done into the user requirements, and this was led, as I said, by Claire Williams, who is an independent consultant and human factors expert, and we held a lot of interviews and workshops with a range of local authorities, and it was so useful to get first-hand views of kind of what the challenges are and user requirements. So there's a couple of things around the guidance. As I said before, it needs to be truly user-centered. So there's a model that Claire uses, the COM-B model, which this picture shows, and that is basically showing that in order for someone to change their behaviour, they need to have the capability to do it, they need to know how to do it, the opportunity, so they need to have the time and ability and opportunity to do it. And finally, the motivation, so they need to want to do it and understand why it's useful for them. So that model has been really, really helpful in understanding quite well all of the pain points. Basically, all the pain points fit somewhere in that model. And then again, I mentioned earlier that the users, we have primary and secondary users. So the primary users of the guidance will be the people who actually need to read it and use it to work out how to open and share their data. But there will be secondary users, and that could be people who need the data sharing to happen but don't actually have to get into the real detail of it. So the people, senior execs accountable for sharing data, or it could be end users of the data who would like to know what guidance is being provided so that they can basically work within this framework. And then we used a methodology called Idealized Design, and the idea of that is you say to users, in a perfect world, what would you like? So it's a way of, you can't necessarily produce everything that is part of the idealized design, but it's a great way to get people thinking outside the box. So the ideal features of the guidance that the local authorities we spoke to identified are these ones. So in an ideal world, the guidance would be integrated, as in it would be clear how this integrates with other open data approaches across government, so across the DFT, across their own local authorities, that kind of thing. It'll be clear how they need to integrate. It will be inclusive, which means it works for urban and rural local authorities, it works for wealthy and poorer areas, that kind of thing. It'll be searchable, so you don't have to plough your way through hundreds of pages of text to find the specific thing that you're looking for. It will be possible to go straight to the thing that you're interested in. An interesting one was that it would be two-way, so that if you started using the guidance and you get stuck, there'll be something you can do. You can ask for help. So somewhere, some help button, which is an interesting one. And then another thing was a request for it to be a collaboration space, and this is kind of similar but more around a community. So again, if users could join up in a collaboration area, that they could support each other and say, who's done this, what do I need to be aware of, that kind of thing. And that's interesting because that could be provided by STBs, for example, who we know are helping local authorities in their area to share data. So maybe that would be provided in that sort of way. And then another key aim or request, sorry, was that it needs to be updated and maintained. So there's no point us producing guidance with links in it that get broken, or as soon as you've written some guidance, the next year it's out of date. So the idea that it should be maintained in future. And then one for it to have downloadable resources. So there might be a key section that's really interesting to someone and they want to be able to take that and download it to come back to. And finally, a multimedia sort of format. And I guess this is just moving with the times, that people don't want, as I said, a 100-page report to read that has to sit on their bookshelf. They'd ideally prefer this to be multimedia and potentially have, rather than everything being text, have podcasts or little snippets of video showing how something could be done, that sort of thing. So again, not promising that these can all happen because this was an idealized design, but it's really useful to kind of have a view of what people would like in an ideal world. Okay, so from there, it's kind of how do we turn that into guidance? So this is not necessarily what the guidance is going to look like, but it's just starting to think about the potential content. And so what was really clear from some of the interviews and workshops was people literally saying, I don't even know where to start. I don't even really know what open data is. So this idea of having some section right at the start that says this is what we mean by open data, and just the basics and the journey of producing open data, that sort of thing. Quite an easy way in basically to the guidance, and things like busting the myths as well. So, you know, if people say, oh, I can't open my data because of GDPR, we know for a fact that that's not actually the case. And there's hundreds of examples where people have, you know, worked and sorted out the GDPR issues, and no, it's not a problem at all. It's more of a perceived issue. And then probably something else around, if people think the only reason you should open your data is if you can make money off it. Again, we don't think there's masses of revenue heading to local authorities immediately just as a result of opening data. That's another kind of myth that we need to bust. It's more about the value of the data. And then a really big one, why should we open our data? So this could be case studies where people have done it really well. It could be, as I was saying before, the operational benefits. And something that again has come out really clearly for us is that actually the first thing to do is open your data internally across local authorities. So there's brilliant examples of people just sharing data internally to have a much better understanding of how traffic might affect, I don't know, asset management, or people using open data in order to improve journey times for health and social care vehicles, improve journey times for bin lorries, that sort of thing. So there's something around opening data. Some of the benefits are internal, and then potentially think about the external data sharing as a next step. And then the really important, like the bulk of the guidance is the question, how do we open our data? And won't go into these in massive details, but Graham mentioned an end-to-end process at the start, and this could be the steps, or not this exact these exact things, but this could be turn into our steps in our end-to-end process. So the first thing to do is work out what data you have. So don't start from the thing of we need to get some data so we can share it. There's some massive wins, just quick wins from the data that people already have, like traffic signals, flow counts, bike schemes, all that stuff. Identifying which data it's really useful to share. And then the next step is understanding what data should be shared and what is going to be valuable about sharing the data. So the business case for sharing the data. Then there's something about getting the resources, so either internal or needing to get external expertise, partnering, how to procure services if necessary, and how to be an intelligent client. So not to buy something that turns out to not do what you expected it to, that sort of thing. And then there's obviously a really key thing around standards, and if you use open data standards, it's going to be far easier to open your data. So kind of what standards do we need to use, and how, that kind of thing. We mentioned partnering and procuring, and then what to do about legal issues or security or GDPR, all key issues, and probably with relatively straightforward answers, so that's good. And then there's another really key thing that we've heard about, people publishing their data and nobody knows it's there and nobody does anything with it. So there's a really key step, which is how do we let people know that we've done this? And obviously there's things like the national access point, which will become a really key route for letting people know, so people can go to the national access point and find out what's there. So it has to be published there and have the right metadata that people understand what the data is. And then the last few steps are kind of sort of housekeeping. So how do we know it's working? How do we know how many people are using our data, that sort of thing? How do we maintain the data that's there? Because another pain point was publishing data and then discovering that it's gone out of date or it's not working anymore, that sort of thing. And how do we keep expanding and adding additional data sources as we decide that they're useful? And then the final one is just about that thing of, if you get stuck, who can we ask? Who can we go to? So how do we get further support? So that's kind of the user needs and how that could be turned into the guidance that we're going to start writing. And if you can think of anything that we haven't covered here, now is the time to tell us, because we're about to start writing this. So if there's a really, really important section of the guidance that we haven't said anything about, please let us know. So if you could type in the chat pane anything, any pain points that we haven't thought of or anything else that we should cover in the guidance, please just type in the chat pane and that would be really useful. Thank you. And then the other really important part of the user requirement specification is to identify the things that actually the guidance isn't going to fix. So there's a couple of really key ones. And again, going back to the COM-B model, it kind of quite a nice fit. So in terms of capability, the guidance can give people information, but it's not an IT course for someone. It's not a, so there might be some level of upskilling that is required over and above anything that we can provide in the guidance. And then a key thing around opportunity that we heard from several people again is that local authority organisational structures and culture, people saying, well, I want to share my data, but I'm not allowed, or I want to get this bit of data from somebody else and they won't give it to me, that sort of thing. So that's not going to be solved by our guidance. And then the last one is motivation, and this feeds into the idea of the communities. So that is obviously not really in scope of the guidance, but it's a really big thing to be aware of, and it's something that came out actually when from a recent investigation for the National Access Point as well, that communities are the best way of helping people share their guidance, which is a really key message, I think. So then on to the next steps, and literally we are just starting to write the guidance. So we've been working on the structure in the last few days, and next week we will start to write this stuff. So it will contain kind of how-to guides for basic things. It'll contain case studies to show where people have had really, really positive results from sharing their guidance. The other thing we've realised is we shouldn't be reinventing stuff. So if there's a really helpful website about what to do with procurement, we will link to that website. We won't repeat everything that's said in it. So some standard stuff that a local authority has successfully produced GDPR text that other people can copy, or standard clauses that you can put in your procurements to make sure that you get open data as part of it. And then business case advice, which again is a really, really key thing, because if you don't have a business case, you're not going to persuade your bosses to let you do this, or you're not going to have a reason to do it, basically. So understanding the business case. And again, that all feeds into the COM-B model. So there's it's really helpful to have that model to understand what we need to be sharing in the guidance. So that's it. So as I said, if you have any thoughts on other things that we should be doing with the guidance, we have had several authorities kind of volunteer. So because we want this to be so user-centred, We want to be engaging with local authorities throughout the next couple of months when we're producing the guidance. So we want to be able to hold workshops to show people what we're doing and say, would this work for you? Is this right? We want to be able to potentially send people sections and say, you know, please mark this up in red text. Obviously, understanding that not everybody has hours and hours to spare, but you know, we really do want feedback on this to make sure that it actually works when we've finished. So please, if you'd like to volunteer to help us, again, just contact us or mention in the chat, and that would be fantastic. Thank you, and that's it. Oh, and so we're now going to we've got 7 minutes for a Q&A. If anybody has any questions, I don't know if we've had any through.
Hi Jill, it's Darren.
Hi.
We've had one from Keely Franklin, which is this going to become an absolute requirement for local authorities rather than a suggestion?
Yeah, so Graham might want to chip in on this. Oh, Graham does want to chip in on this.
Yeah, it's probably easier if I answer that one. Sorry, I heard most of that question, but you broke up slightly in the middle of that. Is this going to become a...
Sorry, the question was, I've lost it now. The question was, is this going to become an absolute requirement for local authorities rather than a suggestion? No,
it is what it says. It is guidance, and it's very much there to steer local authorities towards a nationally consistent approach built on the work which we believe determines what local authorities want to deliver, how they want to deliver, and through user research, provide a document which is valuable to them, but it's purely guidance.
Thank you. And a second question: we've had a couple of questions come in about whether this session is being recorded, which it is. It will be available, and the slides will be provided as well. They'll be available by the TTF website. But one further question about the presentation you just given. What about data retention periods? You focused on live data, but is historical data to be covered too?
Yeah, so yes, I think so. I mean, people might not want to start sharing historical data from many years ago, but I guess there's a few things here, isn't there? So historical data, any live data published today will potentially become historical data tomorrow, kind of thing. And there's a question about maintaining that and making sure that it's potentially archived correctly, that sort of thing. But yes, if people wanted to share historical data, we will add that to the things that we're going to cover in terms of guidance, I think.
I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of data local authorities most collect is historical in many forms, and certainly the early instance of data sharing on the national access point is mostly focused on historical static data, but a lot of real value, as Jill talks about, is in real-time data, which is something which will develop, I think, more over time as we develop and we invest and we work with local authorities to deliver that.
Good stuff. Thank you, Graham. I think that's it. I think we have answered the questions, so you are now dismissed. Thank you. Thank you for that excellent presentation.